I'm Linda Protopappas. I'm the Executive Vice President of Sales. Today during our webinar, you're going to learn more about implementation dates are changing. Noridian and CGS were 714 is now 62. Do you know how to take advantage of the new 85 Cpt codes just released last week? Can you still get paid for COVID only testing? Do you really need a Z code? To walk you through these, it is our honor to introduce you to our Director of Laboratory Services Support at HealthRecon Connect, Mr. William Baus. William has over 15 years of experience in healthcare revenue cycle management. His last decade has been entirely focused on laboratory revenue cycle, building onshore, offshore, and hybrid teams to satisfy the needs of his clients. William has worked inside laboratories as the Internal Revenue Cycle Director with preview over every step of the revenue cycle process, as well as managing RCM vendors. William is tirelessly focused on compliantly maximizing the revenue for laboratories, whether it's through adoption of technology, application of deep state knowledge of payer and national coding policies, or providing access to relationships that can change the bottom line for labs. A few reminders to all of our attendees. If you would like to ask a question, you may do so by sharing your questions via the chat box or raising your hand, upon which one of our team members will enable your audio. Following the conclusion of the webinar, please take a few minutes of your time to fill a short survey. Let us know what you liked about this webinar, how we can improve, and what other topics you would be interested in future webinars. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be published on all of our social media pages in 2 to 3 weeks. Please do keep an eye out for the post and do share the link with your colleagues who couldn't make it to today's webinar. Also, just to let you know, if your colleagues did not make today's webinar, we have a following updated webinar on June 8th, next week, Wednesday at the same time. Please register for it. With that said, it's time to get the show on the road, and over to you, William. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Linda, and welcome everyone. Greetings, salutations. Happy you're here with us today. And so this is just a quick update for everybody on the craziness that the MolDX Syndromic Panel LCDs are creating for everyone. So we already basically talked about what our agenda is. As always, don't do this at home. Call us, let us help you. We're not taking any responsibility for the information we give you today and you take and it does or doesn't work for you or expectations are not met. You definitely need to be talking to us before you make changes to your policies. Okay, so a quick brief update. I'm going to skip over some of the basic topics of what these syndromic panel LCDs are. We've got a previous webinar that goes into a lot of detail about all the details of what are in there and what are all of the specific little requirements about the LCD. What we're going to focus on today are the things that have changed recently. But just as a reminder, what we're looking at are Palmetto, Noridian, WPS, and CGS. Those are the Medicare Administrative Contractor companies that utilize the MolDX Z code program. So if you're not in one of those MACs, then the discussion we're having is not 100% germane to you, although tangentially this means, well, people don't have Z codes and they need people that, you know, they can send their samples to because other people might still be able to bill them and run those samples. Well, then that could happen in, say, a Novitas or First Coast or NGS region. So NGS is split in two. Palmetto is over here, CGS is here, WPS is also split in two, and Noridian is split in two. Incidentally, this is why you will notice that there are two LCDs. Same exact verbiage for Noridian and for WPS, for example, but for each region, they create its own separate LCD. They all have the same implementation dates, incidentally, as well. So let's move on. All right, so first things, this is one of the biggest things that is changing is when are these changes going to be effective? It appeared a couple of weeks ago that Palmetto would be 517. And we're going to get into what a revision is and what the revision actually says and what is the impact of what is the revision and when does that have an impact on when something might be implemented. And it's going to be a little subtle and some confusing thing, but if you want to latch on to something to remember, well, it was going to be 517, now it looks like it's 417, and I'll give you my rationale for that. So that'll probably be a surprise for a lot of people. And then CGS and Noridian, it was 715. Now it's been moved back up to 6-1, which is yay today. So problems for some people that 2 weeks ago would have been expecting to have another month and a half. So we will be talking about that in some detail. Okay, so here's what CGS and Noridian have on their LCDs and billing and coding articles. If we go into that in a lot more detail, but just briefly, an LCD is a local coverage determination, and it's usually the very wordy part of well, what they're talking about and what they want you to do and what their philosophy is about why they pay for something or why they don't pay for something. Then the billing and coding article is where the rubber really hits the road in terms of, well, these are the CPT codes you can use, and if we're going to pay for them, then they're linked to diagnostic codes that are required. And at higher levels of codes, you might need more than one diagnostic code. And you'll see that kind of philosophy repeated even outside of the MolDX MACs, where you're going to see requirements for larger panels to be related to some form of immunocompromised patient. Somebody with HIV, somebody getting a transplant, somebody that has a genetic disorder that affects their immune system. Typically, these would be people that you wouldn't normally see in an outpatient setting. And this is all kind of mentioned in that LCD. And we did go into more detail that in a previous article. But that's one kind of takeaway from all of this is that's one way to limit your patient population that would be a target for a particular test. Bigger panels need to be immunocompromised. Okay, so what's really important to notice about this is on 519 for CGS and Noridian, you'll see at the top, even still today, although this will disappear, and this is something important to pay attention to, is they say stuff and then poof, it's gone, right? And so they literally explain to us that, hey, the original notice period was, going to end on 4/16, but then they said that they were going to extend it to 7/16, but then they changed it back to 6/2. So I feel really safe in the context of CGS and Noridian that they should not be processing any of your infectious disease syndromic panels under this LCD. And what's really good about it is they actually recorded that revision in the revision history. And this is really important to understand. When they say that a revision is effective, they're talking about the revision itself is effective. So if the policy had already been in effect, then whatever revision they talk about, like they've added a diagnostic code or some CPT codes, which they did, and you will see that, well, then those CPT codes would only have been available from the revision history date moving forward. Now, it's also hard for these bigger companies to pay attention to all of that too. So expect denials that they might be processing your claim, even though it had a data service of prior to 6/1, that, or 6/2, it looks like, that you're, they might still be expecting you to have a Z code, for example, and you don't, but the data service was before 6/2, and then they deny you anyways because they've already implemented edits looking for Z codes, so you're going to start getting denials. So you'd have to really kind of pay attention to that because they should not be doing that, right? And I've already got indication that they are doing that. So that's something you want to pay attention to, but your billing team would be able to appeal that, and you'd be able to indicate, well, this is actually telling us, look, the revision effective date is 7/16. The revision explanation is the notice period is being extended. So that is what the revision is. is the notice period was being extended. And this is revision 1 for CGS and Noridian, right? And then they give you some other reasons about it. And then they even mention, yeah, we said it's going to be 7/16, but then it's now 6/2. So that's how it is, right? So, yay, notice period ends today. It's documented. We're good to go on CGS and Noridian for everything, a data service up until tomorrow, right? Now, for Palmetto and WPS, well, originally they had that same yellow thing talking about the notice period had extended to 5/17, but what they didn't do is they didn't create a little revision history recording that. So if you read the LCD today, it looks to me like they're going to try to be processing things as of 4/17. And if you tried to go and point at the LCD and say, hey, you guys did that wrong, well, there's nothing for you to point at anymore. So, and there's been a couple of deletions in things where they did not record that in the revisions. And we're going to talk about that in a minute about whether or not you need a Z code. Answer to that is, yeah, you probably need one now, even if you are using an FDA approved test. And we'll talk about that in a second. So because of that, I'd say your expectation should be that by date of service of 4/17, Palmetto and WPS are going to start saying when they process that claim that it better have a Z code based on, and you'll hear me give the details about maybe the one out you still have about not having a Z code, but they're going to be expecting that. They're going to be expecting those diagnostic codes. They're going to expect the Cpt codes to be utilized in the way that they are describing. And so, yeah, but anything before 4/17 shouldn't be processed that way. And you should be able to point to the LCD and say, hey, you're not processing my claim under the right rules. And expect possible issues with COVID claims. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. And it's just on paper, but I think there's two good arguments against it. And so I'll give you those as well. A little bit of a reminder here, if you haven't seen the other webinar, that would be that, well, what are the tests that we're talking about? And so they're NAT tests, sometimes just NAT or sometimes NAAT, of which are PCR is one, and there are many other types, but so anything that's a nucleic acid amplification test is covered under this LCD. So another way to say that information would be, well, what is not covered under this LCD? So inpatient testing, so they're talking about, you know, people on Part A benefits. If you're thinking of Medicare, anybody on Part A would be an inpatient. Panels intended for home use. So, you know, all of the over-the-counter lateral flow devices that, you know, people are getting for free from their insurance companies. So kind of not really a thing to say anymore, but back when they wrote this, it was a deal. Metagenomic next generation sequencing, so NGS, right? So if you were doing infectious disease on NGS, well, then that would have different policies for you. Mass spectrometry, interestingly, that's a method for looking for infectious disease detection, and fish testing. And that's not to say that those kind of testings don't have LCDs. They do, they just don't fall under the jurisdiction of these molecular syndromic infectious disease panels that we are talking about today. Okay, so do I need a Z code? So this is the first thing that has gotten a little bit out of hand. And so let me first start off by saying what they said originally. So this little flow chart would have been useful in determining that. Is your test FDA approved? Well, if you're not using FDA approved tests at all, right, then you didn't need to, you definitely needed a Z code, right? So there was no question about that. Now, if you were using like a BioFire or something like that, and it was FDA approved, and you were going to use a CPT code that had a diagnostic code combination in the billing and coding article, they literally said, right, if you use the DX codes, then you don't need a Z code. And there was a sentence at the top of every code group in the billing and coding article that is now not there and is not even listed in the revisions as ever having been there, and they deleted it. So there's that, but then there's even something more that they've all added as a revision date of 5/17. And I'd also like to point out that those revisions weren't there on 5/17 for everybody else besides Palmetto, who have now all adopted this. Okay, so let me be clear. The only difference that I have identified, and I did look again just this morning, there are no content differences in what is being said and how they're going to process their claims at this moment in time now. Last week there were, and I'll point out what those were. But what is different is when these things are going to be implemented. And we already went over that. I'm kind of seriously thinking they're going to go back to 4/17 for Palmetto. And for us, it is 6/2 by date of service forward that it will be done. Your notice period ended today. And so let's look at this. All right, so I know it's really small. What I'm showing you here is we effectively have two different sets of revisions happening to the article. And the revisions are the same, the content is the same, but when they're doing them is different. Okay, so as of 5/17 for Palmetto, what they're saying is that tests that are FDA approved and cleared and performed in ways consistent with the intended use labeling directions do not require a Z code when billed with an appropriate accompanying ICD-10 code. So we still have that sentence. But here's the part they've added. However, if you do more than one test, then you're going to need to use code 87999, which they did already tell us in the past, but that would require a Z code and a technical assessment. So effectively, if you're doing more than one FDA approved test, then you're going to need a Z code. What I have not seen yet is, well, maybe we'll be okay with, say, like, the specific bundled code for RPP, 87631, for example, or for the, the GI code where it's a bundled code and that's one test, even though we're doing multiple pathogens. But if you were actually trying to do, say, a UTI or a nail or a wound, and you needed to use a couple of different individual pathogen codes, which you didn't even have until 5/17, but now you do, and we're going to take a look at those. Like, they added a whole new code group, right? It was conspicuously absent that I didn't have any CPT codes for any of the individual pathogens, right? Well, now we do. And so now they're telling you, right, if you use more than two tests, which would be easily identifiable as two codes, right? Well, then you're going to need a Z code. Or let's say you tried to do a respiratory pathogen viral bundled code, and then you also said, well, I guess the bacteria, so I should put the bacteria in. Boom, you're busted. Now they're going to be looking for a Z code, and effectively you should have been using 87999, and you need a Z code when you do that, right? So yay, but here's the other really important thing. That is the revision that is effective on 5/17. So if they make their policy for WPS and Palmetto effective as of 4/16, well, you've got a whole month where they shouldn't be denying you for that either. So if there are denials, there's stuff to fight with here, and you need to work with your billing company. And we would love to do that for you. Now, what you'll notice is it's 6/2 for CGS and Noridian. And the reason it is 6/2 is because Noridian and CGS, their notice period was extended originally to 7/15 and then back to 6/2. And so that's tomorrow. And so going forward from tomorrow, since you didn't have to worry about anything before 6/2 anyways, that's when this becomes effective. So that's how to read through. And I know this has been confusing because I've had this question a couple of times from different laboratories where they were, interested in trying to figure out, well, when is it effective and what's a revision and all that. And so just again, to really nail this all down, if the revision tells you that it's an extension of the notice period, well, then the revision is that the notice period has been extended, and that means nothing is applicable before that date, which is what happened for us in CGS and Noridian. And that's what they said they were going to do in Palmetto when they moved it to 5/17. But they've switched it up now that the only thing that is really changing for them as of 5/17 is that this part of the revision. And here's the other thing. I don't know how they're going to be able to distinguish with that. And are they going to set their flags up to go, oh, well, this was, this was 420. So up until then, you didn't need a Z code if you were using 2 CPT codes. But now, after 517, we're going to start doing it. They're going to have one edit and deny you on all that stuff. So you're going to want to really look at what were the dates of service and what is that denial and decide how to fight that. But I think that's what's going to start needing to happen from a billing perspective. Okay, so now we get to the super fun part. You've got a whole new code group. And I mean, literally as of last week, and this is what's funny to me too, is they'll have revisions like they said that they did it on 517. They didn't, because it wasn't even there last week for everybody else besides Palmetto. Palmetto was the only one that had a code group 8, but now they all have code group 8. So let me see. I'm going to need to pull that up. There it is. And move it over there. Okay. Linda, can you guys see that screen? I want to make sure it's sharing the right screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so this is the LCD. Yep. There's the building coding article. Okay, so this is a new group, group 8, and it contains 85 codes. And as you can see, these are all CPT codes of our individual infectious agents. There are some that are actually missing in here, which is interesting. I think we need to probably say something to them and say, hey, there's a couple of other individuals you don't have in here. But for the most part, you've got good coverage on what you would expect to see in an RPP panel or a GI panel, or what their concept of a UGAG STI panel is, which really isn't an STI panel. But you're starting to see all of our nice little individual pathogen codes that were completely missing before are now in here. And we're going to talk about how they can be used, but I want to point out something down here at the very bottom. Now, what should have been a concern for all of us would have been the conspicuous absence of COVID tests, CPT codes. and they actually say in the LCD, all that written out mumbo jumbo they have in there, that any infectious disease panels looking for less than 2 pathogens isn't medically necessary. So that should have been like a big red flag, like, whoa, what's that going to do for me in COVID? Am I going to get paid for COVID anymore? Blah, 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 right? Well, you can see they've added the codes in, so you can get them. But now here's the thing. What's Palmetto going to do about that? If they say they implemented on 417, and you're billing code between 417 and 517, and these code groups didn't exist until 517, are they just not going to pay us for a month? Or are they just going to ignore it and go with the edit that they've got in place for 517, even though we've got other dates of service? You see how this is going to be a little bit confusing for everyone involved in the process, right? So let me go back to the top of this and point out how we can use these. And this is so funny because it even contradicts itself right here, right? Because in the LCD, it says, you know what? Anything with less than 2 pathogens, not medically necessary, right? And then they're like, well, anything greater than 2 pathogens that you bill from here, we're not going to pay for either, right? So it's like they're really honing in on what they're going to pay for. So the following CPT codes are not covered for a given beneficiary on the data service when greater than 1 of these CPT codes is billed in conjunction with anything from group 1 to 7. So prior to this, we had our 1 to 7 groups. Our 1 to 7 groups were RPP of 3 to 5, GI of 3 to 5, and then I think it was UGAG, and then meningoencephalitis, and then bloodborne pathogens, and then we went to the RPP of greater than 6 pathogens, and the GI of greater than 6 pathogens, where you get another whole, yay, more fun, add another diagnostic code in to actually get those paid, right? And again, if you want more details about all that kind of stuff, we did another webinar on that. Now, what also is notably interesting that they added, right, and was conspicuously absent, was 87801, which was in the GI panel, but not in the RPP panel, but is now in our RPP panel. which kind of gives you an out for indicating that, well, you know, I did my 3 to 5 viral targets, but what do I do about my bacterial targets, right? And you would need an extra indication to be covered for that kind of stuff, as you can see below in group 8, them kind of talking about that. But that one would be roughly 70, and then that's your $142 there, right? Now, down here on group 8, I could do like an 87631 and then add, you know, one of these individual pathogens, of which you may have had many, right? But as soon as you're doing anything more than that 87631, and let's say you were FDA approved, well, now you need a Z code, and then they want you to use 87999, right? So it's really confusing what they're saying, and I think there's going to be a couple of different ways things can get coded out. But in general, you're basically not going to get more than your extra $35 on top of any bundled code when they say this top sentence. That's what it means. You can build one of those with one of the other ones, and that's okay. But you're going to need a Z code when you do that. So, yay. Because that means you're billing more than one test, right? So definitely need a Z code. Additionally, the following CPT codes are not covered for a given beneficiary in the same data service when greater than 2 are billed. So you could put together any panel and they'll give you basically $70, but they're going to pay you for 2 pathogens. Now, I still think you need to go through the process of creating your Z code. And when you go, well, it's not a thing. You have to, right? I mean, they basically have told you, right? Unless you're doing one test, then you definitely, you need a Z code, right? So then technically speaking, if you were doing COVID, that's a good question for people to ask is, well, do I need a Z code for COVID? Well, let's talk about that for a quick second. That's one test, but it's 2 codes. Well, assuming that you actually did high throughput methodology, and there's a very specific definition of that, but effectively it means you've done greater than 200 samples in a day. And if you're doing that, well, then you get the 5, and the 5 is just saying that you did it within 48 hours. That's how you get your extra $25. And then you'll be using the 3 or the 4, and that's your $75. That adds up to your $100 for the Medicare fee schedule. That's one test. You don't need a Z code for it. It couldn't hurt you to get a Z code for it, but from what they've said, you would not need to get a Z code. Although they keep changing things, so that's as it is today. Let's see, how much time do we have left? Okay, so I got 2 more minutes. So we talked about that, and we talked about 87801, and yeah, well, and I think some of this is going to even impact you on when you get your Z codes, because of course, when you put out your Z codes for something like your UTI or your nail or your wound, and which by the way, I'm thinking nail is going to be a lot harder to sell to them, because in every one of these LCDs, oh my goodness, I don't know how to spell it anymore. Onchomycosis. There's actually a sentence in here that literally says they don't think, where's the CAC? There it is. Okay. Overall, the panel expressed the key consideration. Finally, there was a consensus that the use of this technology in the diagnosis of onchomycosis, the fungal infections of the nail, were unnecessary. So I probably wouldn't start out with nail. I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask, right? But all the LCDs kind of say that, right? And so it doesn't seem like they really like that. But for say nail or wound or UTI, you don't have any bundled codes that represent a panel for those panels. And so you're going to bill it out with individual codes. That's what you're going to ask for. And what they're going to come back with is, well, here's your CPT codes, and whatever CPT code it is, well, that's what you're going to be able to bill and get paid for. But it is likely, if you're doing a lot of individual tests, they're probably going to give you an 87999, which is an unlisted code. Then you got to go through gap fill and then get a fee schedule for that unlisted code. So that's going to be interesting to see how they handle that as we get through doing the Z codes. But you're going to put it in, you're going to ask for what you want, and then they're going to tell you what CPT codes they're going to let you use. So another, now that they have put into place well, here's the CPT codes, and they've already said that they're not going to pay for more than 2, then they might limit you on those codes and give you those codes. So, you know, if that happens, I would then try to go back and maybe do an 87999 and get a gap fill. But again, you can work with us and we'll help you work through all that kind of stuff. The last thing I thought I wanted to mention was, if you look at the MolDX molecular syndromic panels, if you happen to be in Palmetto or WPS and you start getting denials, this is what I would argue, because MolDX is basically saying a syndromic panel that detects multiple different pathogens, blah, blah, blah. But then they go on to say, if it only detects one thing, then it's not a syndromic panel and therefore should not apply to the LCD. So that's a contradiction to what we were just looking at, which is they put in COVID testing, which is one test. And so now it is in the LCD. So I'm telling you that the MACs themselves are going to be confused. There seems to be a misalignment with MolDX. So also to point out, while Palmetto owns the MolDX program and the DEX Z-code exchange, Palmetto itself as a Medicare administrative contractor is doing things separately. And also to point out that it is Palmetto that administers and runs and owns the MolDX program. So the other MACs, like Noridian and CGS and WPS, they're not as in tune with what the MolDX program is because their parent company doesn't own it. So expect conflicting processing of claims. Expect that your claims will probably not be processed according to data service properly. Expect that trying to fight with them about this stuff is probably going to take a long time, because it looks to me like they're confused as well as to what they're doing. And even the people that are, you know, the 27 layers below, the people who write policy, who actually put database flags in, may not understand what they're supposed to be flagging and not. So proceed with caution, in abundance of caution. I would definitely do that. Get your Z codes. That's going to be better protection than trying to do any FDA approved test. And as we've seen, it looks like if you try to use anything more than one CPT code, you're going to get denied. They're going to say, where's your Z code? So yeah, that's what I would highly caution everybody, that this is going to be a very volatile time for payment. And so be ready to roll with the punches. So in conclusion, I'm not seeing, do we have any questions?
Does anyone have any questions? We'll open the floor for the next 10-15 minutes to ask William any questions regarding MolDX Z.
Oh, looks like there's maybe one. For RPP testing, the infectious disease doctor carve out to order the testing without a Z code. The LCD is a term outside the requirement. Where can we find Medicare specific patient outlines the requirements, ways the infectious disease doctor can order? I'm sorry, I was reading that to myself and I should have been, yeah. So for RPP testing, the infectious disease doctor, it's down here. The infectious disease doctor carve out to order the testing without a Z code on the LCD term outside requirement. Where can we find Medicare specific definition that outlines the requirement in specific ways and infectious disease doctor can order? Okay, I'm gonna need you to keep typing to me. I'm gonna pull up that part of the LCD and show you what I think about that. I think the question, and forgive me, no disrespect. I don't agree with the question that the presumption of the question is that you can avoid needing a Z code by a doctor order for all of the things I just got done saying. But let's go and look at that explicitly, and I'll try to identify what that is. And the word doesn't really matter what LCD I'm looking at. The words are going to be the same for everybody. So I presume we're talking about, like they pretty much say this on a lot of them, right? RPP will have, you need to be a pulmonary at the higher level, right? You need a pulmonologist to order it, or an infectious disease specialist.
But I do remember a question very similar to this related to UTI from someone at some point, a very similar question. And it was related to, so the patient needs to be symptomatic and at higher risk for UTI complications. So right now I can tell you, if we were talking about UTI, and may I ask you, were you asking about UTI? Because if you are, I've got an easier way to answer this question, because it literally says in the response to comments that, yeah, for anything that doesn't already have a CPT code or a diagnostic code, you need a Z code. So it's not about these guys ordering it. It's about whether you were FDA approved and not using greater than one test, and they would have done that. Okay, so you can include a UTI. All right, so let me say all of I'm saying in general, but I also can point something out about UTI explicitly. So you'll notice in this LCD that it mentions UTI, but then you will notice in the billing and coding article, it explicitly does not discuss any panel called UTI. And you, up until now, you would not have even had a CPT code you could have used for UTI, except maybe 87801 because it appeared under one of the other panels. But now in code group 8, you do have a lot of specific pathogens that you could choose from, but then they're telling you they're not going to pay for anything more than 2, which is why I'm still, you want to get a Z code because you need to get paid more than $70. But let's say, okay, the patient is symptomatic, i.e. the elderly patient and or seen in a urogynecology or urology specialty care setting. So this is about who can order the test. And they're saying that the patient is symptomatic and at a higher risk for UTI complications, and or, so I don't, as long as I have this first part, they're saying that's okay. So the patient being symptomatic and at higher risk for UTI complications, right? So I've got that. That's a good enough reason for me to order it, and it doesn't necessarily need to be ordered by urogynecology or your urology specialty care, because that is and or. Actually, no, I'm sorry, I've got that backwards.
William, Roger is adding to his question also.
The highlighted section states it will be covered if seeing urology specialty care. Does that mean since the patient is seeing specialists, they can order that? No. So, oh, sorry guys, I keep reading his question too fast. The highlighted section states it will be covered if seen in urology specialty care. Does that mean since the patient is seeing a specialist, they can order without a Z code? And the answer to that is no. And I'm saying that because the only time you don't need a Z code is stated up here. Services that do not have FDA approved indicated uses. So I guess let me ask this. Is the test you're talking about FDA approved? And for UTI, I know it cannot be, or at least Medicare thinks it cannot be. And this is the answer I was going to give very quickly is they say in the billing, in the response to comments section that there are no FDA approved UTI tests, right? And so therefore you need a Z code. But this is the one sentence that was confusing for me and a lot of people. So if you do not have an FDA approved test, right, and that you did the test in ways that were consistent with the intended labeling directions, then it requires that you register with the MolDX program and get a technical assessment. So it says that. Then most recently, they've added into their revisions another statement, right? That is in the billing and coding article, where it says this, tests that are FDA approved and cleared and performed in ways consistent with their intended use labelings do not require a Z code when billed with an appropriate accompanying ICD-10 code. However, if you do more than one test, then you need to use 87999, and if you do that, then you need a Z code. So the thing about needing a Z code is only about one thing. It's not about who orders it or any of that stuff. It's about once you test FDA approved.
William, your volume keeps going in and out. I'm sorry. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? How about now?
Yes, sir.
That's weird. It just like randomly switched to a different soundboard. Okay. What did you hear the part about 87999? What was the last thing you heard, Linda?
You may want to repeat that.
Okay. What was I saying? So the whole point about needing a Z code or not is about literally whether you're FDA approved or not. And so the only time that you don't need a Z code is if your test is FDA approved and you're not doing more than one test and you use a CPT code and diagnostic code that are in the billing and coding article. So that's like 10 reasons right there why you need a Z code. And here's, let me point that out about how this works really quickly. So when I want to bill a CPT code from group 1, which is for respiratory panels, right? So right there's a big clue to us, right? That I can't get paid for nail, wound, UTI, ophthalmology, or any other thing you want to make up. Not that you personally are making anything up. I mean, us in the industry, we make up panels, right? But anything that isn't listed here, which isn't one of these code group 1 through 7, then it doesn't exist as far as Medicare is concerned. And if it doesn't exist, then you don't even have a diagnostic code group to go to, which is why they're saying, go get a Z code, because if you get a Z code, I'm going to know what you're doing because you have a Z code. I'm not going to use some code group distinction in the billing and coding article. So as there is nothing in here, group 3, for the closest group that we would have found would have been the urogenital anogenital panel that we might have thought, hey, we could put we could do a UTI panel in here. Well, you can't, right? We've got our BVAP panels for women's health. We had, and then an 87801, which is multiple pathogens. You get to bill that one time, and then that's $70, right? So that's not going to work for you for a UTI panel, right? So since you don't even have a panel, and thus because you don't have a panel, there's nothing for you to link it to in your diagnostic code group, then you don't have a diagnostic code you can use. So if you don't have a diagnostic code, that's one of the things you would need to be able to say that I've got an FDA approved test, and you would do it. Now, further to just kill the idea of UTI explicitly and specifically, but then I think you could also use the same thought process for the nail wound and UTI and everybody else. What am I looking for? Response to comments. And man, what did it say? I'll find it for you really quick. It's not that far down here. Panel, this next one. Okay, so again, it's that paragraph, right, that we were talking about. If you're FDA approved and cleared, and you use the ICD-10s and the CPT codes and the billing and coding article, that stuff we just went over, then you don't need a Z code, right? But here, for example, there are currently no FDA approved and cleared indicated uses for urinary tract infection panels, and there are no predicates. It just means previous tests people might have done. As such, at present, molecular UTI panel tests must submit for a Z code and undergo a TA in order. So you could also take that and go, yeah, it's going to be the same for wound and nail and ophthalmology and anything else that wasn't explicitly listed in that billing and coding article. Oh, and there's one more thing that I think is really important to mention about. And by the way, let me know if you still got more questions. I'm interested in this because I would like the answer to be no, we don't need a Z code. But just let me know. Okay, yes, some of the BioFire tests are FDA cleared, but I just got done talking to somebody for a few minutes right before I had this webinar to do, and
they have received denials and they used BioFire. What I haven't determined yet is how it was billed. My assumption is they probably tried to bill more than one CPT code. But so yes, some BioFires are FDA cleared. I've got somebody that's did that, billed it, didn't have a Z code, and used an FDA cleared and approved RPP panel. I just don't know how it was coded. But that brings me back to this statement here. Man, doesn't really matter. I can go to any of them. This statement up here where they say, however, so the first thing is, oh yeah, it's okay, it's FDA as long as you use a diagnostic code and CPT code from the billing coding article. Yay, go for it, do FDA approved. That's what they're telling us, right? But then they go, however, if you're doing greater than one test, and I'm thinking they probably tried to bill something on top of their 87631, right? And that's probably what got them not paid. Plus, these guys could also not be following their own darn policy, and they put a flag in looking for a Z code. And if you don't have a Z code, you're going to get denied. And then you're going to have to send in your documentation. And then you're going to say, hey, here's what I did and why I did it. And I don't need a Z code because I'm using an FDA approved test. And then you're going to need to send them documentation that says, yeah, man, I'm using BioFire. Here's my 510K. And so pay me, right? So I think that kind of stuff could be going on too. Remember, that's one big thing about Medicare is everybody kind of assumes that, man, I'm going to say that, it's going to sound real negative. These are really big government kind of organizations, although you can't technically say that. A Medicare approved contractor is a private company, but they really do operate like government institutions. And so sometimes the left hand and the right hand doesn't know what it's doing. And if you understood that these systems that they're using are rather archaic in terms of how they process claims, and all of them are going through different upgrade processes. I mean, even two of them that are owned by the same parent company, like Novitas and First Coast and Florida Blue, all owned by the same company, they actually use different processing systems, and you actually get different results even though they have the same LCD because of how they implement flags and stuff in their database. So what is written down may not be necessarily what actually happens. To think that because you get paid from Medicare means that you've gotten some approval on that is absolutely incorrect. You need to have in your own mind why you did what you did, and you refer to the documentation about what there is, and you argue with them to get that payment, because they will do things that they don't know, that they're even violating their own darn policies sometimes. So wait, so that was a long answer for BioFire's FDA cleared, right? So yeah, some of them are FDA cleared. I think it's going to matter how we code it, even then they might still deny us, and then we can appeal it and say, hey, we don't need a Z code because your thing says this, right? Yeah. How many people are on this webinar? Has anyone received a reimbursement rate as yet for their panel? If so, can you share that price? Has anyone explored developing a test? So yeah, if anybody answers, I will share that. But there's some things I could probably mention to you, right? You're going to top out on an RPP panel at 210, right? For 3 to 5 pathogens. And I say this with clarity because even when you get a Z code, they're still going to follow this billing and coding article, right? It's not just like, oh, hey, you got a Z code, oh, free pass, right? That's not happening, right? They're still going to expect you to have those diagnostic codes, right? And as part of you filling out your, the technical assessment, there are sections in there where, you're going to be saying what you say, but then they're going to come back and go, yeah, we've already gone through all that. The only thing where I think there's going to be an unexpected amount is probably for something like UTI, nail, wound, ophthalmology, right? And then if you kind of put it in alignment with what they're going to pay for these things, then there's that. But I can actually show you really quick as I go through the 7 code groups, if you're billing this stuff, what you would get paid, right? You're looking at, sorry, that's a lot to look at, right? So, 87631, 3637, those are all $142.63. And so the best case scenario is you could go down to code group 8, maybe add in 2 more codes. That's going to be $70. Or if you just did an 87801, that's $70. So 70 plus 142 is like 210. So that's it. You're done. I don't think you're ever going to get any more money for 3 to 5 pathogen panel, right? And when I'm saying 3 to 5, I'm talking about the viral targets. And the only way we're going to get these extra $70 is to say, I did some bacterial targets, which has never really been fully addressed. I mean, one way of interpreting it is they're just going to be like, no, what I meant was it's either 87631 or 87801, right? And any of these U codes in here that have a U in them, right? Those are PLA codes, and you would know if you, like, I think BioFire actually has a PLA code, right? So I think you end up using a PLA code for them. So for the GI panel, oh, incidentally, by that, let me just make sure I'm not over on time here. For Novitas and First Coast, on 5/28, the comment period ended for the GI panel. So those are not MolDX Max. But if you're in one of those Max, the comment period ended for an updated LCD that's going to require you to have an immunocompromised patient to get paid for the second tier and above, the third tier and the 416. This code here is, I think it's like $120. For some reason, it's not $142. It's not exactly the same. But by the time we get to the second and third tier of this code, and that's how these codes work, right? See, 87631 is 3 to 5 pathogens, and then 6 to 11. This one is 3 to 5 pathogens. It should be $142, but it's like $120. But then the second tier kind of lines up right up with RPP, which is 262, which would be 87632 or 87506. And then there's 87507, which is worth $416. And you notice they never give you any other CPT codes to use with that, right? And that's because the actual name of the code or the description of the code, it doesn't identify that it's viral only. This is why you see this kind of stuff going on. And what we're doing here with an 87631, it's explicitly mentioning it's only viral, right? So what do I do about the other bacterial targets, right? And then you bring up the whole thing about whether that's medically necessary or not, and blah, 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 right? So there's a lot more to talk about with that when you think about building out your panel, right? So the meningioencephalitis, man, I think this one's something like 260. And then, I never even bothered to look up the bloodstream infection panel because nobody does it. And then these UGAG, right? So this one is 262. This one is like half of that. It's probably like $140, something like that. 87800 or 01, those are $70 codes, but it's multiple organisms. They don't define what it is. So it's technically, Medicare isn't even using this code the right way. That should have been for a non-speciated result of like, if you were doing 5 pathogens and you just go, yeah, man, you're positive for one of them, but I don't know which one, which would be appropriate. Like, let's say if you were doing Candida, right? And you're not going to tell them whether it was Tropicalis or whatever else there was, right? And you just go, yeah, you got Candida. Well, that's the code you're supposed to use. That's not how Medicare is using that code, or it doesn't look like it to me, at least anyways. So then your extended respiratory pathogen panel, right? The 3.2 is like 262 and the 3.3 is 416. Then you're back to the 87801, which is $70. And then you've got all these U codes, which depends on what those are PLA codes, and you'd know if you could use them because it would be a code you made or you bought it because you bought that test. And the same for the expanded gastro panels. It's like 262 and then, or maybe it's 226, and then 416 at the top tier. So it's interesting to me that RPP and GI kind of are lockstep in the dollar amount that they think about. And that's what you should think about too, right? Is, what do you think? What do you think you even have a possibility of getting when you're doing a UTI or a nail or a wound or oncology? Well, the top amount of money they've ever paid for anything is between 12 and 25 targets would be $416. So that's probably the top end of what anybody's going to get. And also know that there does seem to be a trend, regardless of MolDX or not, that they're basically the higher you get into the more pathogens, the more they're going to expect you to have additional diagnostic code requirements. So you'd be looking at, like, as you do for GI and RPP, you are looking at immunocompromised patients, right? And you may say, well, what does that mean? Well, go look at code group 7 in the diagnostic codes, and that'll tell you what they think that is. They're giving you explicit, specific diagnostic codes you need to have. You know, the only anomaly to anything that I just said there about thinking about where your boundaries of where you could reasonably expect to get paid something for, you know, a 25 pathogen target would be the meningoencephalitis one, which for some reason is 12 to 25 targets, but I think this is only like 260. So somewhere between 260 and 400 is, you know, not an unreasonable expectation, but probably not $600, right? And then I think the other thing to think about too is as far as oh, I just lost my thought because I started reading another question. Oh, commercials. PCR technology in relationship to infectious disease will not be dealt with on the commercial level as, oh, let's just call them all in you know, syndromic panels. It's more like, and there's a question here that I'm going to answer. You asked me what MACs are not using MolDX. That's Novitas, First Coast, and NGS, not to be confused with next generation sequencing, but National Government Services. And I'll, just for fun, I will put that up on the screen so you guys can see that while I'm talking. Probably is a quicker way to do that. There we go. So I tell you up here in the right-hand corner, Palmetto, Noridian, WPS, that's what's changing. The ones that are not, Novitas, First Coast, and NGS, and then you can see over here what states those are. So commercially speaking, they're much more in alignment with the way Novitas and First Coast and NGS think about it, which is they currently still have separate LCDs for RPP and GI. They have not created anything for, say, nail wound or UTI. And if you think about that commercially is okay with paying for respiratory pathogen panels using PCR technology. They're totally cool with that. What they're also pretty cool with is doing that for GI. Lots of policies about that, indicating that they're okay with paying for infectious disease testing using that technology. But as soon as you get to UTI, there is a conspicuous lack of specific payer policies regarding that. What you do see then are either A, if they do have an explicit policy about UTI at all, it will be microbiology cultures. That's what they're going to expect. And they'll say, doing it on PCR is experimental investigational, and we think you should use cultures. And they will have policies about cultures. Wherein they don't have anything that explicitly says, oh, this is what I feel about UTI PCR. What you'll notice is they literally don't pay for certain codes. Like they don't pay for 87798, which is your go-to code for any pathogen you're going to test that doesn't have a specific pathogen. They'll be like, I don't pay for that one. I don't pay for this one. I don't pay for that one. But they do pay for some. So I do see people getting paid for UTI PCR in a commercial setting. But what I don't see is that they're ever getting paid for their full panel. But this is difficult for people to look at unless you actually ask for reporting from your billing company to see it spelled out on a line item level per CPT code and knowing whether you got paid for it or not. And I think what you're going to find in alignment with the policies is, well, there are certain pathogens that they pay for with their own specific pathogen code. But because you don't know if you're testing chlamydia from an STI versus a UTI versus people looking for it in an RPP, they don't know. And since they haven't created explicit policies looking for specific diagnostic codes to be linked to specific CPT codes, they're paying for some of them. And I think it's literally because they don't know that they're paying for UTI PCR. And they think they're paying for, you know, another PCR test, like maybe a gastroenterologist test, a GI panel or an RPP panel. So yeah, I think that's what's going on with that. And I think that's important for people to think about. Like, hey, it's not time to just go full bore commercial until you start, you know, working with a billing company that's going to look at the payer policies for you and your particular region. Okay, do PGX tests need a Z code? Yes, ma'am, sir. I don't know. It was anonymous. Yes, they do. And if you're looking for what tests require a MolDX Z code, there's two places to go. The right place to go would be on the MolDX website, and you go into frequently asked questions, and in here they tell you, who uses the MolDX program. Of note that there's actually, like, North Carolina Blue Cross Blue Shield does. That's the only commercial one that I knew about. And then, of course, don't forget UHC, regardless of whether you are in a MolDX MAC or not, which I think is absolute not okay for them to do, but that's what they're going to do. They're going to require Z codes when you're billing the Medicare Advantage program. And I think that says that in here somewhere too. It's in here somewhere in this FAQ. You just have to run through it. And there was another reason I wanted to show you this. Oh, the CPT codes that are covered. Somewhere in here, they talk about that. Actually, I have something else. It's anything that starts with 81 and now 87, but it should be any molecular diagnostic test. Here's how you can do it. Look, you go to MCD lookup, MCD search, and then you type in MDT. So molecular diagnostic test. Now, only the MolDX MACs have this particular billing and coding article, but what I think is also funny is they keep talking about, oh, I got to update all these other LCDs. Well, they haven't even updated this one yet. But this is the billing and coding article that you go to that tells you what codes you need a Z code for. They tell you the codeless fallen scope is but not automatically imply coverage. Well, they're just telling you, just because I have a CPT code for something doesn't mean you're going to get paid. But this is your list of molecular diagnostic tests, right? The information on contains billing coding guidelines implemented for molecular diagnostic tests. And so it's a list of, hey, these are, and you'll notice they're all 81s, but we got more codes than 81s that are now on part of that test. And on the MolDX website, they kind of point out what the other ones are. But for right now, the only ones that you needed are the ones that start with 81 or 87, right? But technically speaking, and this was actually in one of the response to comments, Medicare was responding to somebody saying, hey, it seems like a little bit quick for y'all to say that we need to get Z codes, right? And Medicare's response was, yeah, well, we've been doing this since 2011. And, we told you that all molecular diagnostic tests are going to need a Z code at some point. So go ahead and do them, which I think is a horrible idea for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, until 4/1, April 1st, Fool's Day, no fool in here, they literally had no technical assessment form. So even if you had gotten a Z code, you would have had to redo it again anyways, because you would have had to get a TA now, right? There didn't even have a specific syndromic technical assessment form. So, doing it way ahead of the time is probably not that beneficial, but having contact with a billing company or that's going to pay attention to your policies, that's important. Shameless self-plug here. I do that kind of stuff, so I'm always happy to talk to somebody and have the chance to entice them in for billing services. So you can always give me an email or a text if you've got a question, and then we'll be doing newsletters that talk about that kind of stuff to keep people up to date. So it looks like that's it for questions. Hey, I really appreciate it. If you're still here, thank you guys for being here. And sorry, we didn't have anybody that wanted to share their reimbursement rates on the panels. Roger, you should give me a call. There's a couple of people that are developing tests. So my number is, let me see if I can answer live, right? I'll just put it out there. It's 214-517-9884. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, that's just marking them off. Is there? Yeah.
Put it on the chat screen.
Right, where's the chat? There it is, chat. So 214-517-9884, and then I am William at, and then William at HealthRecon.com. Don't forget the 2 N's. Boom. All right. So Yay. And we went over a little bit, but not too bad, huh?
That's perfect. Thank you, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this comes to a close. Just to let you know that I will be sending out William's presentation as well as his contact information and the video of this webinar. If you have any other questions, please let us know. With that being said, thank you so very much and have a lovely day.